Okay. Hi, Richard.
Hello, Anna.
So this feels like a real privilege, an opportunity to turn the lens on you after you interviewed me a couple of months ago. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to you and finding out a bit more about your journey. So to start with then, can you just tell me a bit about your background and how you got into the body image work? What was it that drew you to it initially?
Okay, so this story is going to hinge around the year 2014 because that's when I became aware of body dysmorphic disorder and started to enter into that world. Prior to that, my relevant background was what you could broadly call for the, I guess, 14 years prior to that, from the age of 18 up, I'd been involved with spirituality, essentially, like meditation and a kind of Eastern introspective spirituality called Advaita Vedanta, which really asks a lot of questions, I suppose, about the deepest part of our being, the bit that's witnessing, watching all the rest, and getting in touch with that. And then seeing that as a basis to become more objective about the world around us and our own individual selves. So that's kind of what I've been, the kind of conscious exploration I've been involved in. And around 2014, I'd actually been involved in setting up a little group with associates and friends of mine from that world, where we were looking to extend that kind of core principle out into different areas. And the area I was particularly interested in at the time was any kind of transformation in the psyche. Okay, because in some senses, you could think of thoughts, and this kind of fascinated me that thoughts are ethereal, right? And if I ask you to think of a pink elephant, you almost can't not do it. So it should, in that sense, be very easy to change our minds as compared to something like very solid, like a brick wall, which you can't push over. But actually, if you have a deeply entrenched belief about something, you will be far faster knocking that wall down with a hammer than you ever would be changing the belief. So the thing that seems to be very ethereal and it can change and go everywhere is actually very, very solid, where the material world, with its apparent solidity, uh, isn't so much. And that kind of fascinated me. Well, how do we make these shifts in thought? And then seeing that they would sometimes, I would have a randomly arising substantial shift in perception of something that could be very personally liberating to me. I think, okay, well, what goes on there where this very solid thing suddenly becomes like liquid for a moment and it can flow and change and reset into another form? So that's what I was really considering. And I'd rolled out exercises in the group around that with my friends and associates. And it was like a peer to peer group, right, with people I trusted and trusted their capabilities to go through this stuff. So it was a really good place for exploration. And then at the beginning of 2014, I saw what is, I think, quite a famous documentary in the body dysmorphia world, Too Ugly for Love. I think it was the BBC that did it, and it's quite hard to find online now. But it followed the lives of these three people, two women and a man, who was suffering with body dysmorphia. And there was something about it I just found really, like, I couldn't look away, kind of captivating. It really captivated my mind on a couple of different levels. I think with this interest in perception, like I'm always interested in why people see the world differently. Okay, and the fact that these people saw themselves so differently, I'll maybe touch on more on that in a moment, was interesting. I also felt I could see parallels with what you would read in some like philosophical or spiritual texts regarding there's a kind of narrative in Greek mystical or early Christian mystical thought, or even like Buddhist stuff about the being born is like the soul coming into the body, and it's like the soul gets really drunk and it wakes up in a body and it goes, oh, what's this? I'm stuck in this thing now, and it's awful. And you have mystical writers like the Greek philosopher Plotinus, who his student said of him, Plotinus is a man who he always seemed to be ashamed to be in his body, but he's really expanding his intellect and his mind and his introspection into consciousness. But the body is this awkward bit that's stuck on the end of it. Um, and that probably resonated with my own feelings about my physicality, right? So I'm not saying all that stuff about the soul coming into the body because I think it's objectively true, Anna. It's just it's very definitely a way people perceive themselves. Okay. So I thought, like, hey, I'd like to roll out some exercises looking at this, particularly about what it is that how we can find that maybe people who are kind of spiritually inclined find their bodies difficult, but also spirituality can be a way to really integrate with the body and come into a real kind of oneness with it. So I designed some stuff to roll out the next time we were meeting up. And what that led to was then a lot of conversations with friends that you would never normally have, right? Because I didn't go around asking people, hey, what do you think of your body? Are you comfortable in it? Do you, think you're an attractive human being? Or do you, da, da, da? And all of a sudden I was kind of having those conversations and quite shocked that like everyone had a different perception of their physicality than I would have thought they would have done, right? Like, even my like very beautiful, lovely friends were often much less secure in their bodies than I would have thought. Um, so that was interesting. That just that this whole hidden world going on actually that we certainly I didn't talk about, and people would have narratives about how those shapes had those patterns of thought had shaped themselves. Usually, some people could like remember incidents of bullying a child and go, "Oh yeah, from ever since that happened, then I felt like this," and the impact it had then had on their lives and the kind of constraining factor. So I started rolling out these exercises, which were very personally transformative for me. And as they developed, I turned them into a kind of workshop, which I ultimately ran with a psychotherapist. And then I met our good friend, Nicole Schnackenberg, Dr. Nicole. And ultimately, we started running, we got on very well. Nicole had just written this big book, which was like all the thoughts I was having, but expressed in a with Nicole's intelligence and quality of writing. So it's like meeting a better version of yourself in some ways. It's like um, so Nicole and I started running this online support group, which we did for a number of years. After that, rolling out these kind of principles that we very much shared around how to look at body image, and that ultimately led to me doing a small study, and yeah, that's the origin of that journey. So I'll pause there, Anna, and before going on to anything else, and yeah, I'll hand it back over to you there.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to hear the journey from your background in spirituality and the communities that you were involved with and the introspection and the kinds of practices that you were doing there, and then moving into the body dysmorphia world, much more kind of a mental health type space, a clinical space, a space of psychology. Um, but yeah, that you were starting to draw parallels and sort of see this idea of the nature of perception being something that could shift and change. And this was something that you were curious about. I think what's really interesting about your particular journey into this is that it's coming from more of that lens of curiosity and philosophy and spirituality, as opposed to how many people come in is from often a place of complete hopelessness and despair, and was looking for an answer to their difficulty, their challenge. So I think in a way there's this other lens that you bring to it, while at the same time having an empathy for the experience of the dysmorphia, and that you relate it with, or you did relate it with, lots of people around you and friends, and started to be curious that perhaps this isn't just a clinical disorder experienced by a few members of the population, but this is something that might be more part of the wider human experience. So could you tell me a bit more then, just what happened then once you started to establish these principles and you were really curious about this, and you talked about a study that you started to design. So could you tell me more about what happened with that?
Yeah, so we had a number of people at the group, and as much as we're testing what in this bag of tricks we developed works and what doesn't, and what do people seem to find helpful and not, as you well know, like another major aspect of this is how to encourage people to come through the door, okay, and how best to serve people in that way, in a way that's welcoming, because that's such a big thing, right? Because people say, well, it won't work for me, and I'm glad it's there for other people, but I'm beyond hope, and these kind of thoughts. So how do you engage people? And partly as a form of engagement, and partly as a form of wanting to just have some of the very most basic documentation of what what we were doing, I offered out to do a study where I would run approximately 6 sessions with people and document before and after. Okay, so this is not the most empirically rigorous study ever performed that proves something beyond all doubt. And I wasn't aiming for that. I was aiming for what my limited resources allowed me to do in terms of just getting some kind of sense of what worked and what didn't for people in that. And I think there was 18 people signed up without looking at it. And I ended up with like a 160-page document of notes, which quite surprised me, which I then boiled down to like a 20-page summary, which people can download, right, from that. And essentially, it went well. All the feedback I got was overwhelmingly positive for that. Some of the stuff that I thought would be helpful and necessary was. Other parts of it wasn't so much. So it was surprising to me what came out of it. And I'll elaborate on that.
Could you just describe a bit what you were doing in this stuff? What were the sessions like?
Yes.
What was your thinking behind the design of the way that you ran those sessions?
The way I would start off would be to say, okay, there's like two ways of looking at this. Okay, so you could look at dysmorphia or anything else that goes wrong on a psychological level as like a crap thing that happens that you want to get rid of. Okay, and if there was a magic pill that would just make it go away forever and you could be normal, you definitely want to take that. Completely understandable, right? That you would want to, like, given the horrors it inflicts. Okay, but you could actually turn that on its head and say, well, maybe there's like a meaning to this, and maybe this is not like just an awful thing. Okay, and if we touch it softly and palpitate it and allow it to open up and take a kind of curiosity into it, this could actually be the key to the soul, if you like. So I'm contrasting a sort of materialistic and more spiritual kind of way of looking at the psyche, if you like. Is the psyche just some random thing that goes wrong from time to time and needs to be knocked back into shape with a hammer? Or does the psyche in some sense know what it's doing? And when it has these eruptions, it represents an imbalance in the entire system. Okay, so what I was suggesting to people is like, not to come down on either side of that line, but just for a while, put the first way down and let's have a look at the second way of looking at this. So then we would usually do some meditation exercises to like still the mind in a way that a more objective sense of looking could be found. So an analogy I would have for this, if I, or you, the listener, cups your hands over your eyes, don't do this if you're driving, then if I do that, all I can see is my hands, obviously. But in another sense, I can't see my hands at all because they're far too close. So what I want to do is move my hands away, and then I can say, oh yeah, there's two of them, and there's 5 fingers on each, and 2 of those fingers are thumbs, and they've got lines on. Okay, so distance creates perspective. Okay, it allows me to see because it's not too close to me. And what the meditation exercise is really intended to do was create that kind of psychological distance between your core self, if you like, and the part of you that's having all these negative BDD thoughts. Okay, so you can get a sense of like, oh, are these objectively true? In some sense, it was coming into objectivity. So there was that, and this reframing of like not trying to get rid of, not trying to do away with, not trying to letting go of the intention of coming into these sessions and thinking, right, I want to be cured in the 6 sessions and get on with my life, but rather opening to and just being curious and not seeing it as a bad thing. Just put that down for a while. You can pick it up later if you want, but just put that down. The thing that came back was, I think because of who I am, I tend to be quite a metaphysical person, okay, as you will well know, Anna, and I'm like interested in the structure of reality and that kind of thing. I loaded a bit, probably too much of that in. Not so many people found that helpful, which is like, the kind of more philosophical angle of it, right? Which I'm not saying I beat people around the head with this, but I did, I thought that would be really an important part of it, to have some sort of like philosophical framework behind it, which people did not report that as being like super helpful. What was overwhelmingly reported as the most helpful thing was that reframing away from just the stress of, I've got this thing, I really want to get on with my life, but I've got to get rid of this thing first. And I can't really live until I've got rid of the thing, okay? And the constant battle and struggle against the BDD. Moving from that to an acceptance and a curiosity, and a not just, rather than try and get rid of it, let's just be curious about it. Let's almost fall in love with it, if you like. Let's find out really what it is on its surface. And then when we fully explore the surface, maybe a little more depth will open up, a little more and a little more. What I felt I was doing by the end of it was, I think anyone who's ever done anything like this, right? Everyone wants to be the hero in a cape, and everyone wants to be there doing a session, and the person suddenly opens their eyes and goes, oh my goodness, I now understand everything about why I'm like this way. And then they report to you months later that they never had another BDD thought again, right? That didn't happen. And I felt like what I was doing was reframing the foundations. It actually, there was a lady who got back to me maybe 6 months later, and she'd gone off and done something else, and then said that she really, some months had gone by where she hadn't had any sort of real BDD thoughts. So she felt that she had really strongly stepped out of it. And people did have insight that helped in that. But overwhelmingly, I decided the most important thing is like good foundations, right? Because if you reframe the way you're thinking about this, that's something you can draw on for the rest of your life then. And these experiences may still be very challenging. They may get less challenging. They may get less ruinous at least. but they will also become enriching in some sense. In the same way that as soon as I, in some ways acknowledged my own issues of my physicality and started having conversations with friends, a kind of rich dialogue opened up where I got to know them better. And suddenly we're talking beyond our masks, okay, about our perceptions of ourselves. So it's the willingness to step in and to embrace opens up a richness of this. That was like the foundational thing that I think was reflected back to me time after time. Some people found the meditations really helpful. Some people not quite as helpful. That varied, but the consistency was like acceptance. Yeah, acceptance absolutely is the thing it boiled down to.
Thank you. So it seemed like the conversations that you were having with people were opening up this sense of curiosity and acceptance and seeing that the BDD wasn't something to get away from, but it was something to potentially be a key to a greater depth of understanding of self, of connection with another, with you, in that instance, but that you were providing people a reframing that's what they found most helpful from those sessions. Can you just elaborate a bit more on the meditations that you were doing? Because I understand from a philosophical or content point of view the idea, but I'm just wondering from an experiential point of view, the experience that you were providing in that session and how you think that impacted people.
Sure. So the meditations, really the first session was based around me getting to know the person and getting to know how they responded to the meditations. Okay. So at the most basic level, the meditation is simply a watching of the breath. And for some people, that would be all they would ever want to do. Okay. And going beyond that was kind of tricky. And you don't really need to go beyond that. But just, okay, so I take a few breaths and then I start to feel my feelings about things, and then those feelings become overwhelming and really drawn into them. So I anchor myself on the breath. I just come back and take some breaths again and get some degree of space. And the breath is like a solid anchor that if I bring my attention back to it, I can just get that moment of escape and release and see that there's just a little tiny separation between the thoughts and me, and the thoughts aren't me. Going beyond that, and this is kind of like my specialty, if I have a specialty, is this exploration and delving into consciousness. So the meditations could be a lot more introspective in terms of like I appreciate people listening, right? I know a lot of people find these concepts challenging if you're not immersed in them for a good while. I'm sort of cautious because people can lose the thread at this point with me, and I'm just aware of that in myself, that I've spent a lot of time immersed in this and I don't always get like how far down this rabbit hole I am, right? So but essentially going beyond that, some people did really click into this of awareness becoming aware of itself, this sort of concept that's very central in some of like the Eastern philosophical schools like Advaita, of you become aware of, like, you're really looking inside to find the very core thing that you are, this witnessing awareness that's beyond your thoughts in some way. And I use the analogy of like sleep a lot for this. You're dissolving into that and becoming, stepping back into what they would perceive as like a true self, a truer form of yourself, and finding a freedom that, oh, there's something that feels transcendent and peaceful and whole right at the core of me, and the thoughts orbit around that thing. But by being in that core, the thoughts can calm themselves and come into more harmony and unity.
I think maybe from my experience of them, I'm remembering how impactful they were, and I'm thinking perhaps there's still something more, the essence of something more of those sessions of what you were trying to do and what was successful about them, what was really successful beyond the the curiosity and the acceptance that some people talked about. And maybe that's also linked on to what were those key tenets of it that you think could then be developed to go on to make it even better next time. Maybe what were those kind of key parts of it that you thought, okay, there's something really special in this aspect, and if I were to do it again, I would include more of that, or I would do it like this. So I'm curious, if you were to do the study again, how would you do it? How would you change it, if anything?
I think I would be less attached to a form of it, okay? And I think this is a fairly standard thing people say in all sorts of areas, okay? That you have a formalized way that I need to do step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think I can see ways to be more shorthand, okay? Like I don't necessarily need people to do so much formal. I've probably done less formalized meditation, okay, with people. And maybe I've seen the depths of that more as something I do, which helps me facilitate the session, but not necessarily always helpful to the the recipient. Okay, with some exceptions. Some people like really got into it and thought it was great. So that would be something. I mean, acknowledging that you did the sessions, Anna, I mean, what do you have any thoughts on this, or what? How did you how did you find them? What were your reflections?
No, thank you. But so I think that at the time, one of the things that was most powerful for me was the degree of connection that I felt with you, um, on levels that I don't think I'd experienced before or been given the space to experience before. So, for instance, doing the eye gazing practice, I remember at the time, uh, that being something totally new to me. That one, I could be sat in that level of silence with somebody, but staring eye to eyeball with them. Um, Having been someone that was extremely, avoidant of eye contact, and had experiences of, a very kind of avoidant way of relating to people, I suppose. So that I remember being extremely powerful, coupled with the conversations and the dialogues around becoming curious about the fact that I was perhaps something more than this physical form and the mechanical materialistic view that I'd been brought up with to believe to be. So for me, I think it was the coupling of that.
Yes, I see.
Yeah, that you say there were, for each individual, maybe something slightly different was required in terms of the form, and for some, the aspect wasn't so powerful. But I really think that the aspect of, connecting with another person on that depth, there was a lot of freedom in that, and there was a lot of empowerment in that.
Yeah. So it's interesting. If I can comment on that, I'll do it the reverse way around. It is interesting because it's a number of years ago now, right? And having your reflections, it's making me recognize that I've remembered things in a certain way and I have my own perceptions about it. And I think as I'm sitting here talking to you, I'm maybe leaning into a somewhat secular language, okay, to avoid talks of spirituality and belief. And probably because since the time I did the study, I think a difference in me is that at that time I kind of casually accepted a lot of positions from certain spiritual traditions as almost certainly being true. Okay, like there may be different ways of looking at the world, but that's like the real truth, if you like. And I probably have gone through since then and continue to go through a kind of philosophical refining around that, to where I'm uh, maybe less certain or less able to uh, express with that kind of confidence the truth positions of them, or I'm re-examining it at the very least. And I can feel myself leaning into a more secular vision in terms of presenting this. But you are quite right that a big part of the study, when I say I like overdid the metaphysics, there were people who found it an initiation in terms of an introduction to a spiritual worldview, an introduction that we are more than material beings, that consciousness is fundamentally real in some sense and may transcend the birth and death of the body, and that at our center there is something that's good, and it's good because it's transcendently good. There's this all-loving, all peaceful, all-aware presence that animates the rest of us into life. So there were some people who really didn't want to go down that road with any kind of spiritual concepts. Okay, and it was like the study was good for them too. Okay, it worked like really well without having to believe in anything. I would never encourage people to believe in things, but certainly I would encourage people to open up to possibilities, right? And I think, if I may say so, Anna, between the two of us, you were someone who was very receptive to that, and that was like really good to be able to go down that road. The eye gazing thing was another mixed bag. Some people, a lot of people didn't. I think it's probably a minority of people I did it with, and some people didn't have the cameras on, for example. I did get some negative feedback about it being too much. But the aim of that exercise is, okay, if I can come to see other people in a truer sense, then I can see that maybe they're seeing me that way. So I can look at your eyes now, Anna, and see like the surface material structure of the eye, but I can slip beyond that and see that there's a person inside that body somewhere, it seems, with a whole history and narrative arc and emotions and feelings and relationships and ideas. And there's a completely unique universe that's never existed before, nor will ever again, behind those eyes. And then beyond that, again, you can maybe touch on something we could call spiritual, like some transcendent consciousness that's looking back at me, seeing my physicality and my personhood and something transcendent. And that transcendent thing is innately beautiful, right? And just the fact that you are conscious is like the most incredible thing in the world. The fact that consciousness exists in this universe and is embodied in you is just an unfathomable, incredible mystery that is shining out from your eyes. And if I can touch that and see that in you, and recognize it as then seen in me, and maybe see it in the mirror in me or in the camera in me, that's me too, it changes one's perception of one's physicality, because the physicality is a part, but it's a small part of us, and it might not be the root of beauty, if you like.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. I personally felt that aspect and those kinds of conversations, as I said, fused with the experience of going into a meditative state with you, was extremely, extremely powerful. And working with people with body dysmorphia as I do now, it's something that kind of sentiment is what I believe to be still now one of the most powerful, because if you're talking to people who have become so completely imprisoned by the belief of the deformity, the ugliness of their body, and their body being absolutely their identity, that even introducing those kinds of concepts lightly can have such a tremendous difference. So I think it's really, really important and crucial. And thank you for bringing that in while I understand your
Yeah,
hesitance.
I mean, it's been a while since I've publicly spoken about this, so I feel rusty, right? And I feel like you're warming me up by this conversation. Yeah. But yeah, that was like really an examination of what is beauty, what is lovability. Like, is beauty the structure of your face? Is it having your cheekbones in a certain position? Is it having a certain kind of nose? Or is beauty something far deeper and transcendent, than that? That's what there was an invitation to reflect upon.
Yeah, and I think that on a personal level, what those kinds of ideas bring and prompt one to do is notice, okay, when else in my life have I experienced another like that? Been in that state of understanding that there's a whole universe behind the eyes of that other individual, relating in a more expansive way. And often what that would do is bring me back to very early experiences of being a child, of playing, of being out in nature, of those kinds of experiences where we are freer in ourselves. So yeah, I think it's very important, and provokes deeper conversations about the nature of consciousness and how our understanding of it can actually assist when things do become out of balance. So from a intellectual point of view and an experiential point of view, I think that's, for me, why those sessions were so powerful, and are really worth exploring further in terms of approaches, particularly for BDD. I wanted to ask then as well about how this work and this interest in body image was working in parallel with your other interests, because I know you also have a podcast that's looking at global and political events, exploring in depth the history behind various different kinds of history and concepts. So
Yeah, and it's interesting to have the opportunity to sort of link these two, right? Because they have always, throughout my life, been these two different sides of my being: the sort of spiritual, psychotherapeutic, and the more sort of worldly interest that have run along parallel tracks without even me necessarily always being entirely aware of the relationship between them. So yeah, I do podcast on historical events and all the kind of interesting issues, I suppose. Um, where I see the common thread is that of perception. So I think, Anna, I've always found it fascinating when people who study a subject for a really long time, like decades, in great amounts of depth, disagree with each other. Okay, because it just doesn't seem, it just seems weird to me that two people or two groups of people could look at the same thing more and more and more, and not only have minor disagreements, but have a completely fundamental foundational disagreement about what they're looking at. And looking at it even more probably increases that divide. Okay, so that's the kind of thing I've looked at on the podcast. So, I mean, as an example, I looked at why psychotherapists and psychologists disagree over memory profoundly, like not a little bit, like completely contradict, where psychotherapists think that well, this is not a universal statement, but there's a theme, particularly in trauma therapy, of them thinking that people can repress and recover memories, but you cannot invent memory. Whereas psychologists think it's the opposite way. And they're using two entirely different methodologies. So the psychotherapists are relying on their sort of anecdotal, direct experience of working at the coalface with people and think like, well, this is where you really come to understand someone in depth, not in some laboratory somewhere running silly experiments. Where the psychologists think, oh, the psychotherapists are off there deluding themselves by being too close to it, and you need to step back and be objective. And this doesn't really resolve, this. So those kind of questions, or in a different context, why do the 10 most eminent historians of the First World War all disagree on who was responsible for starting it? How can that be? And how does that, these kind of things? And body dysmorphia, in a sense, or any kind of like dysmorphic sense of oneself, it's really like the ultimate perception thing, right? Of like, why is it that, I have this perception of myself that I'm a monster that no one else has? How have I come into a perception? And how do I maintain that perception doggedly against what everyone else is telling me? Okay. And because it goes beyond the rational in a sense, like we clearly have and adopt an emotional attachment to our beliefs. So to me, what I wanted to do, and through meditation and introspective exercises, is to come back to ask, can we come back to a place of objectivity? Will we stand outside of our attachments to the red team or the blue team? Okay, and then can see why other people have different perspectives on the world than us, because they're fundamentally standing in a different place. Okay, so from the dysmorphia perspective, it's, can I understand why other people don't see me as this awful wretch of a human, in some sense, that I take myself to be, and can I come into their perspective on me? And in doing so, is that healing in some sense? Is it, do we become more human from understanding other points of view and coming to shift in and see the world through the eyes of others? So that it was quite a while before I saw that link, that I was essentially doing the same thing in two different areas, that real interest in perception.
Thank you for that. So can you just tell me a bit more then about how you get into that other perspective? Because I think you have quite a unique way of exploring this, both in terms of your global and political podcast world, but also in terms of how you think about body dysmorphia. And I just want to draw that out a little bit more. Like, what does that mean to you to be able to gain that more objective view in terms of perception? How do you explore that?
Yeah, well, I think that's a crucial question, right? Because if you think about drawings by like the artist Escher or something, so he'll draw, like, just to explain as best I can for people that might not have seen it, Escher would draw like angels and demons in black and white, or pessimists and optimists, but you can only see one at a time. Or if you have an image that doesn't quite make sense, you can, or like the simplest one would be the rabbit and the duck thing you see on Facebook. There's just a wavy line and a dot, and you either see a rabbit or a duck, but you can't see a rabbit or a duck at the same time. And there's a shift that takes place between the two. Okay. And that really what you're asking is, how do you make that shift? And that's quite a mysterious thing, I think. But the way I could relate it is, looking at the duck, you get drawn into duckness, and you kind of like, who the heck is saying this is a rabbit? It's crazy. That's clearly the duck's bill, and that's his head, and that's his eye. And you have to some way gain some space between your perception and the duck image to then step back and go, oh, actually, if I look at it from over here, if I look at this angle, yeah, it's a rabbit. And I've definitely like used meditation very much to facilitate, to grease that wheel, if you like, and make it easier to make that shift. But I think just, I suppose, that the gentle effort to do so, really, just the intention to see the world in a way that you currently don't, and to not be satisfied until you really feel like you've seen it through somebody else's eyes, and to know that there is a perspective there other than my own, to look through. How do you do it, actually? Because you must No, you know what I'm talking about, right? So I think my way of doing it is so tied up with my introspective, meditative approach. To be honest, Anna, it is on my to-do list. It's something that I've been exploring. I was reading a book on this recently, exploring more how other people make that shift, because I'm thinking that the way I do it is in some ways it's great and it's communicable, but if people struggle with that meditative thing, it can then be difficult, right? So I'm curious to explore how other people, when they've had shifts in perspective, what they think facilitated that for them.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question because I was just thinking that to myself that what is the motivation to make that shift? Why is it that someone would go from just seeing the duckness and duck, duck, duck to being curious to want to see the rabbit? So I think from my perspective, the shifts in awareness or shifts in my perception that have happened for me in my life, the motivation to make those shifts has always come from an absolute need, a kind of an existential need. When I'm talking on the deepest level of, yeah, a recognition that there's at times been a great level of pain in just seeing things in the way that I was seeing them. So, in terms of the body dysmorphia, to only be viewing oneself as so disgusting, horrendous, and ugly, and being in that kind of a mindset, that there comes a certain point where the the degree of that torment is so much that there has to be an opening to something else, to another way of seeing it. And I see this actually often with many of the clients that I have, that they've reached a point where even if 100% almost of their vision is telling them that the problem really is them and their disgustingness, that they have a degree of humility to be showing up to a session with me to potentially shift that view. So I suppose what I'm saying is that to a degree, I think there's a kind of rock bottom aspect to this, but is it a breakdown or is it a breakthrough? So I think there's an element of that. And I guess there's, yeah, I think I agree. There's, with that humility comes a level of space. With that space comes a level of clarity. So for me, that does come through meditation, and that comes through teaching people meditation in ways that allow a calming of the system, whether that's through the breath, whether that's through some movement, through connecting with another individual in a deeper way, through a conversation, an insight, a question, an inquiry, if we're talking in a Socratic sense, allowing an opening and allowing a space within somebody to come to that inside themselves. And I think there's something very beautiful about that process always being something that has to come from that individual ultimately, and the motivation often being about deeply about a yearning to connect and to see clearly and to understand. I think that's, for me, what can actually be quite beautiful about a body dysmorphia type experience, is that it can lead to that degree of clarity and ultimately.
Yeah, I think there's aspects of security with it too, right? Like, for example, if I'm convinced it's a duck and I write you an email telling you what a fool you are for saying it's a rabbit, and then I get a t-shirt printed with it's a duck on, and I join a group of people who all think it's a duck, right? I become very personally invested in the idea of this. And then to let go of that, to consider not another point of view, would have like costs to me, mostly like an emotional cost. And what I think the spiritual aspect cultivated for me was a sense of a deeper sense of self. Okay, that I'm okay to let go of the idea it's a duck, because my life is not dependent on it. I am not my opinions. So if you can get any sense of yourself that exists beyond your opinions, then it's okay. It becomes easier to step out of them. Okay, like the psychologist Donald Winnicott talked about opinions thoughts becoming like replacement parental figures. Okay, like you can attach to them very strongly, and you see this in all sorts of political situations. That people like treat it like a sports team. You're for the red team or the blue team, and you grip onto that with dear life. And I think with dysmorphia thoughts, there might be like a different reason for clinging to them very tightly. Like they may provide security in some way. Maybe in the sense that if I knock myself down, no one else can do it. I'm sort of speculating there. Maybe that's something I've sensed in myself around my own dysmorphia. But whatever it is, they clearly have some sort of function. And it's like some part of you thinks it's functional to do this, and it engages with it. So it's getting that sense of safety that it's okay to consider that you might not be awful in whatever way you think you're awful. It's okay to look in the mirror and think, well, maybe not. Maybe I'm an okay human being, physically, mentally, spiritually, on every level. Maybe I bring goodness to the world, and feeling secure to step into that as if that's not going to be like a deeply threatening thing. So any sort of small movement in that way, I think, can open up a greater movement then.
Okay, so I think it would be interesting also just to ask about, based on what you just said, that there could be some kind of function for somebody in continuing to believe in these thoughts, and in this context talking about the body dysmorphic type condition. There's a function in continuing to attach to those thoughts and those beliefs and ideas. And I'm thinking partly from a professional point of view that there's a viewpoint in which the function is about maintaining one's position within the system that person has been in. So talking about a family system usually, that they are playing a certain role in order to maintain contact and connection with that family system. So for somebody with body dysmorphia, it may be that they utilize that almost the self-abuse mechanism as a way to cope with the family system around them, and they're playing that archetype, let's say, within that system. And if we're to look at it that way, I'm curious what your perspective is of how that might translate to a more global political context where people might attach themselves to a particular type of ideology or belief as a way of being part of a certain part of the system. So yeah, I'm just thinking about that because I know you have a very interesting way of looking very holistically and with a kind of systems theory view, or looking in that broader lens. So I'm just curious about what your perspective would be on.
Yeah, well, I do experience this myself, and because I have a grasping for certainty and knowledge about the world too, which part of my podcasting is a more spiritual aspect, if you like, is letting that go to produce something that's more raw and authentic and comes from a place of not having that certainty. So, with regard to how these things form, what I experience in myself, I think, when if I go looking for why I behave in a certain way, okay, or why I feel like, we could have many examples, like, okay, I'm going to do public speaking, and I suddenly find my armpits are getting very sweaty, and my voice locks up. I just can't speak. There's something in me that's like, stop, right? And this is like awful. Or it could be that I'm going to ask somebody out on a date, and the same thing happens, right? It's just like, and rather than do it, I turn around and my legs walk in the opposite direction, almost beyond my power to stop them. It feels like some force has taken over me. And you can insert whatever it is for you here, essentially. So what I would find, like, introspecting on that is there's often like an incident sometime where you've done that and it's not gone well, or there's been some kind of shaming incident, right, in childhood, where it feels like this incredible arising of shame has occurred from being mocked or something. It could be one big incident, it could be like cumulative, and at some point, like, there's a strong intention is set in the psyche of like, I will never allow myself to feel this again, right? And the psyche then responds to that and builds a kind of protective wall around it. So when your legs are walking away from the stage, away from the romantic interest, and you're going, what's going on here? What? The psyche is literally following the intent you set when you were 8, 10, 12 years old, based on what it knew then. And it's in the seeing and unraveling of that, whether the memory is ever touched upon, or whether it's done without that, the unraveling of that and the feeling like, it's safe to let go. But one way you could protect yourself is to have the thought that like I'm horrendously ugly, right? So I could never approach anyone, or I could never stand on a stage, or I could never do this or that, or even not in a physical sense. You could have the sense, well, I'm just really incompetent. I'm just really bad at, this activity or that, so I won't go for that job, or I won't start a business, or I won't engage in because you did something like that and it all collapsed, or someone. It could be a very very minor thing, but it has a disproportionate effect on the psyche. It's interesting. I have a friend who's sort of a public figure who reviewed a lot of his positions on politics and medicine and global warming and different world events, right? And he did this somewhat publicly, right? And he said he got contacted by a lot of different friends who said, "Oh, it's so great that you've done this, and I love that you've rethought this and that and this. Not so sure about that one though, right? Yeah, I really think you've made a mistake on economics. Or I really think your views on global warming are wrong now, or your views on this medical thing or the other thing." And it was funny because what he said to me is everyone had their one thing, and they're all different things. So there is often, I find, inside everyone, and I'm probably as guilty as this of anyone, Anna, that there's like we have certain beliefs which you find it very hard to question because they become foundational, right? And well, hang on, I've built my whole life on this position of economics, and everything I think and every conversation I engage in is based on the either this political party is good and this political party is bad, right? And if that went away, I would collapse in some sense. There will be no more me here to talk or engage with the world in any way. I would lose something of myself. Okay, so that's what I think the kind of core attachment is. Now it might become the more obvious examples, like, well, my job is dependent on believing this, right? But there could be something like that. But I think at a psychological level, that's what it is. That like our sense of self is rooted in certain opinions being true, and it's very, very hard to cope if they're not. Okay, and it's very hard to see. It's very hard to see because we can attach morality to that as well. We can say, well, I think this because it's what good people think, and only a bad person would have that political position or that economic position or think that about the Middle East or something. So it's very hard to see. That's why I say I'm probably as guilty as anyone, because if I do have that, then I probably would be the last person to be aware of it. Although a lot of what I do is striving to have that awareness, and it's also when I notice, like I did some with podcasting, but also I did some songwriting, lyrics writing over the summer, right? Which because I subjected you to them, and I would find it would take time to do, but oftentimes I'd just be rearranging words on a page, and it would just feel very flat. And the point at which it would open up will be the point at which I admitted something to myself that I didn't want to admit. Okay, and then the lyrics would emerge very easily. So it's that willingness to feel secure enough to go to the place that we don't necessarily feel comfortable going to.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was going to be my next point actually, and I'm glad you honed in on it. That you talked about having a striving to be aware and a recognition of this feeling, this sense you get when you're being more honest with yourself in the creative process, that something comes through. I'm curious as to how you think your meditative work and your creative work and your self-inquiry work has had an impact on your political work and your work in the external world. And I suppose what I'm really getting at is, do you think that these kinds of awareness practices have a crucial role in helping people to see more objectively in a political sense?
Yeah, I do. So I have my own sort of way of doing that around being meditatively introspective, and I think probably there are other ways to get there, to the same place. But absolutely. So I think the reason I'm able to do the podcast and to podcast on a variety of different themes, okay, without being an expert in necessarily any of those themes, okay, the thing that I put as the center point for me is the way of looking, okay. And what I think that allows, if we can become detached, it allows for a pluralism where essentially you can build up both sides of an argument and strengthen the case for the red team and for the blue team, the case for the duck and the rabbit. And I think that allows a much greater appreciation of the depth and richness of the landscape to emerge. So what emerges then in a description of an historical event, and let's just say the First World War, because I've mentioned it, right? If you could not be attached to the dastardly Germans, or it was the dastardly Austrians, or the perfidious British, and embrace all those positions, something that's really pluralistic and interwoven, and every time you strengthen one argument, it becomes a way that the other side can then strengthen itself beyond that. So that was a very that's been a very central theme to me. Whereas if you go in with a strong attachment to one position, it'll be kind of flat, okay, and it'll be weak as a an argument, and it won't be very informative because you fail to understand the other person's side of things. Okay, so obviously they're like in. I mean, I don't know if the political world is more divided than ever. It sort of feels like everything is always getting more divided and more on, kind of crazy in the world of politics. But so whether that's the case or not, yeah, I certainly think that's the an antidote, right? Is to not um, even have to let go of your own positions, but to actually make your own positions stronger through embracing the other position. So in dysmorphia, even you could say, well, I'm not letting even go of the idea that I'm this hideous, awful person, but am I brave enough and secure enough to let the opposite also come into being? And the idea, well, maybe that's not the case. Right? So I don't have to fight against my sense of awfulness. It's like
Thank you.
you know, but I can allow this different vision to emerge and the coexistence of that. Protagoras had this statement, the Greek philosopher, that the accumulation of knowledge is not through just building up one side of an argument. It's to make the weaker argument the stronger, and in doing so, advance the motion of the whole, as if two different perspectives on something form like two halves of a wheel, and they need to move together in order to have motion. And that's a really centrally influential thought on everything I do.
Thank you for that. So what's next for you?
Oh, and now you're asking. I don't know. Actually, I'm quite open, right? So I'm continuing to podcast. I have like various themes going. I have one on the situation in the Middle East that's carrying on. I have a podcast series on environmentalism and different perspectives on that that's kind of starting, and in general sort of themes of imperialism, where I try to draw out kind of moral arcs and those kind of themes. And we are exploring doing things with body image, dysmorphia, and that wider world. So I don't know what's emerging there between us, Anna, and where that will go. But I'm really enjoying doing that. So I think we'll have more of these discussions, will we? Hopefully, where we might take certain themes and pick them apart around this. And that will be like the next thing. I will mention the study I mentioned. The summary of it is available from my website. I'll put a link into that. And I'm happy if people have any comments on it or on this and want to contact me. Quite happy to be contacted.
Great. Well, thank you, Richard. Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you and unpacking your journey in this way. And yeah, I'm looking forward to working with you more and seeing where the blend of these different interests you have goes. So yeah, thank
Thank
you
you very
so
much, Anna.
much.